All right, well, I'll try again in my poorly lit for recording basement. This week you have a exam up there. It's up now. You can start on it and keep opening pages until the final date. Now this quiz I'll leave up until a week from Monday. You can check the dates on March, whatever it is, but I suggest that you take it now, following the video and looking over the pages and all those things to get everything right. And as usual, the quiz actually gives you the dates. So if you don't feel like listening to the video, the dates, the page numbers, you can just jump there. It's not a big deal. I've had trouble with this one for a variety of reasons, and I can't figure them out, but I'll work on it. Now, we have 3 chapters, is picture books, is one, poetry another, and then a few questions on traditional literature. And on Monday, we'll take up talking a little bit more about the quiz, the ending of our wonderful fable, a fantastic story about the people who live along the riverbank. But for picture books, and a lot of you might write on your picture books for your book analysis report. Remember, and you can revise this one as well. But make sure you you make use of the book. If you're doing the poetry, make use of the book. There's a lot of interesting things in there for you to offer an analysis of your book. Who's the target audience? Who's the appropriate audience, I should say? How do the illustrations work with the words? How would you describe the illustrations? And remember that in picture book illustrations, according to the definition you find on page 58 of your text, these illustrations are essential to the story's meaning. In other words, the pictures dominate the words, and you can also have a picture book with no words. But you can't have a picture book with no words. Now, picture books are not the same as illustrated books, again on 58. They are, as a general, 32 pages long. They're equally effective with black and white illustrations, and they're characterized, as the previous question suggested, by integral illustrations. But they are not the same as illustrated books, which we'd have a dominance generally of words over the images. And that would be basically what you might call The Wind in the Willows and The Riverside. Now, a transitional book is a type of picture book. They're on 65. They're basically 100 pages long. You don't have to be able to read to get them. It's a good place for people to read. They're episodic as well, as often part of a series. They're very popular. 65. Let me see if I can read you there on 65 what it has to say. 65 says transitional books are books for children who can read but have not become fluent readers. So they're not intended necessarily people who can read, and their average length of 100. And it says they're somewhere between picture books and full-length novels. So you could say they're intended for children who can read. I think actually this is incorrect on the quiz. I'm going to change it. They're intended for children who can read a bit. I thought when I made this quiz last time that somehow the default thing went wrong. So therefore, that's right. Now that I'm rereading the question, you see what can happen if you try to go too quickly, because I don't want this to screw up again, is not is not is. They are intended for children who can read. They are more than 50 pages long. They're often part of a series, but they are not. A transitional book is not a type of picture book. That's what I get it. When you read the question clearly and slowly, which you must do on the quiz. Now, as I didn't use the date before, but in 1657, and is written by John Amos Comenius, who's considered the father of children's literature, though I hate that word. It's considered the first children's picture book, and that's the Orbis Pictus, the World of Pictures. It was a kind of an alphabet book, if you will, for pronunciation. I remember he's also the one who said that effective children's literature is entertaining and edifying. This is kind of a hallmark of what children's literature does. Now, an early important modern picture book, storybook, picture storybook in English was, and it's on page 61, The Tale of Peter Rabbit. Cat in the Hat is much older, and I just did it this last Wednesday. Frog and Toad Are Friends is a kind of a very much like Wind in the Willows. But A Tale of Peter Rabbit became instantly popular and remains popular to books today. Now, another kind of children's book are called interactive books, and they're known for, as described on page 63, encouraging physical and spoken response, so that there is this interaction. You might feel the fur, you might speak out. A lot of these things now have computer chips in them to ensure interaction. Very important books, more and more important as the technology allows, and children's literature as a genre is quick to pick up on modern technology, all the way from when they first did illustrations to now. And another book popular with children that's described on 63 as well are books with pop-up, see-through, and movable pages of all types, and they're called really engineered books. Engineered books, and by the way, they could be alphabet book too, but they're engineered so that there's lots of stuff going on, and they're tactile in a way, but not completely the way interactive books are known. So it's a question of emphasis. Now, concept books are known for their, and this is on 64. Concept books are informational texts. The explanation of ideas, objects, and activities. They don't have characters. So it's more of a fiction instead of a nonfiction, if you will, for children. Then you have something called picture storybooks. They're not the same as illustrated books necessarily, because in here you have text and illustrations occurring with equal frequency. And this is on 64 and 65. And of course, your book gives you plenty of explanations. Now, wordless books are not, and this is back to 63, wordless books are not, which seems counterintuitive, intended for only pre-readers. Wordless books can be very challenging and entertaining, as we saw with our robot book, for instance. Now, defining characteristics of postmodern literary work usually include, on 66 and 67, genre eclecticism. We have lots of mixtures. We don't usually have necessarily straightforward chronological plots. We don't necessarily have an omniscient narrator. Or a specific genre. They're challenging in really interesting ways, and Chesnut is really good on this with things like Stinky Cheese Man and others, where the characters jump out of the book, they argue with other stories, all kinds of things like this. Now, the next section is on poetry. I really stress poetry here. I do it with children. It's important because youngsters usually lose interest in poetry right around 5th grade, which is very unfortunate. And a lot of it's just because of, I would say, unenlightened teaching efforts. It's not to say that teachers are stupid. They have enough work to do. They usually rely on and the same with librarians who don't know better about all the good stuff that's going on in poetry. One thing poetry does do, and it's an essential ingredient it's discussed on 78. Essential ingredient of poetry is a concentration of thought or feelings through precise and imaginative words. In other words, it's compressed language, leaves a lot of room for the reader through implication, makes use of figurative language, rhyme, all kinds of things, but need not have a consistent rhyme pattern. It can have more than two stanzas, and it's not necessarily narrative. It can be lyric, other kinds of stories. Now, simple thoughts or stories told in rhyme with a distinct meter in the textbook's definition of is the verse on 78. We call this verse. The other one may look like they fall into it. It's not simply poetry, but simple thoughts or stories told in rhyme with a distinct meter is the characteristic of verse. Now, you can do lots of things with verse and sound in poetry. For instance, short clip syllables with sharp high vowel sounds are indicative of a rhyme that is, as discussed on 81, fast. You can just feel it if you say it. They're just short words with clipped syllables and high vowels. That's I-E, for instance, and it makes you want to read it quickly, so that it offers a rhythm that's fast. Now, frequent repetition of the same vowel sound within a line or lines of poetry is known as, on page 82, assonance. Now, all of these, alliteration, onomatopoeia, end rhyme, and one are part of compressed language. And one would use something like assonance to show a relationship between words. In other words, it's just not thrown in there just so you can call it poetry. It actually has significance in there. An exaggeration takes place in poetry. Used to highlight reality or point out ridiculousness is called, and on page 82 again, hyperbola, which is a kind of an exaggeration. Hyperbola was, he was not a little smart. And that means he was very smart. And I didn't like him a little. It means you didn't like him a lot. These kinds of things, and those are just simple examples of it. And it's called hyperbola. You can look it up on 82. Also on 82 is the discussion of figurative language, and overlying the specific kind of definition, whatnot, of physical language. We find in it similes, metaphors, metonymy, all kinds of things like this, as a comparing and contrasting one object, idea, or feeling with another, similar to someone is something metaphor. And a way of further engaging the reader, emphasizing a tone, all kinds of uses for figurative language. It's sort of, figurative language is what I would call part of the toolkit for reading and writing poetry. Now, it's really important on 80, when you're going to use poetry in class, and it's an important criterion in selecting poems for children, is to select poems by a variety of poets, including children's favorite poets, ones they've heard over and over again. But you can bring in others to decide what to use. But one of the things when you're evaluating poetry that you're choosing for not to do, you want ideas to be fresh and imaginative. You want poems that relate, that are appropriate to children, and you see the way the ages are broken down in your book. And really the big thing too, really very important, is that the poem represents the world through a child's perspective. That didn't really happen until Rudyard Kipling wrote his that we looked at in class, like The Shadow and things like that. A lot of it was, in the long run, nostalgic poetry about childhood that means nothing to children because they're living it, so they're not nostalgic about it. That's for adults pretending to be children. So you want to make the one you don't want to think about is, oh my gosh, that the poem is, make sure the poem teaches a lesson related to the curriculum. This is a way to deaden poetry for everybody. Of course, some of the poems will relate to the curriculum, of course, but you can't tie your hands on these things. And, recent studies, poetry at elementary school have shown that this is on 80 and repeated on 86 because it's important. The children today, in general, are exposed to a narrow range of poets and poetry. The traditional things. The popularity with children is decreasing significantly, and many teachers and librarians don't know aware of what's best or most recent. For instance, um, to look at places like Excellent in Poetry Awards and things like that, we've seen that the text offers us many, 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 many um, uh, internet-related web pages and, of course, books. But for quick look, that's what you want, is find out what's good and recent, and then think about what your class is like, and you can start matching poetry. But you want to do it every day. You don't want to just make it a week-long kind of thing. You want to make it part of what children do. Now, famous among the traditional poems would be something like Mother Goose. And it was first used, as it says on page 83, in France by Charles Perrault, who was what we want to call one of the great progenitors of the written fairy tales. And we still read his fairy tales, but when he started doing things more for children, he used the term Mother Goose and contes de fées, fairy tales. So he wrote them down and became popular, and those poems were translated into English and are still read today. Poems, fairy tales, and of course the little, Mother Goose is poetry, basically. Now, the golden age for poetry in children, that's page 83 and 84, were the first to produce poems that interpreted life from a child's perspective. Usually people of color and girls were probably not included, and it didn't produce outstanding poets who provided children with moral lessons through poetry. That had been going along a long time. But the poems that interpreted life from a child's perspective, we see with Rudyard Kipling, were very important because these engaged the children in the works at hand. Now, I've talked about the second golden age in poetry, discussed on page 84 in your book. It's not called the second golden age, but really is the 60s and the 70s, was the trend towards realism in the 60s and the 70s. Protest poetry, poems by and about people of color, and poems about girls in non-traditional roles were a result. And we saw some of that poetry by Grace Nichols from the Caribbean, and then Lucille Clifton, where her poem about a young black boy living in the inner city of Detroit. And of course, who wrote there's the poem about the dying sheep, and also the Iron Giant, Ted Hughes, who said that poets owe it to children to tell them the truth. And as I said, often with a bit of a proplastic. Now we find that less and less today. It was a lot more of direct poetry. I think the most effective is still that doesn't try to scare the bejeebies out of children, but touches on important issues in their life. Now, traditional literature today, and these are the third chapter that we're talking about, is remember, this stuff is the original written down kind of thing. It does provide insights into cultural beliefs and values, as noted on 96 in your book. That is to say, they are artifacts, and we can learn by remembering when these things are originally put down. They reflect certain ideologies. A lot of them are very paternalistic, chauvinistic even, and put women in very, very traditional roles the stuff like that. The stepmother is always bad, if you will. But they do provide insights to cultural beliefs and values, as do modern literature based on traditional literature. We change the story, which is exactly what happened in on the riverbank, where we have the inclusion of a strong, rounded, well-developed women characters, which were absent from the literature of the period that the original volume, the original story was written. Now, settings to that effect, that they might reflect cultural values and whatnot, but the settings in traditional literature, as page 96 underscores, they're generally unimportant and vaguely described. It might be a forest, but it's not a specific one. It's just in there to lay a foundation for the story, because usually, there's a bad character and a good character, and that's what's really important in them. And so the characters in traditional literature are typically, as we see on page 96 again, easily identifiable as good or bad. And usually in these stories, the older fables and whatnot, good prevails over bad. Unless someone is really stupid, and believes a snake. And then folklore, 97, we often look at folklore and think, well, something's really, really old, belonging to the original folk, whose identity we don't know, but they're still being created today. So it's not like folklore has died. It's still with us, especially in terms of things like tall stories in the United States. Now, today, folklore tales are considered particularly appropriate for, and there is no age bracket here, as 99 suggests. It's children age 3 and up. To our childish selves, we still like those stories too. But the cutoff age is usually 3, because there's a plot to follow, things along those lines. And then on 101, the book talks about the religious literature. And of course, admitting the difficulties, all the other literature, epic is too long for children. Myths are often violent, and fables is not considered religious. The religious story is called a parable on 101. And these are the stories Jesus tells about the Good Samaritan, a whole bunch of the others that you know of in the New Testament. And invariably, Jesus will tell the story, and one of the apostles will ask him what it means, and then he'll give the significance. So parables are interesting. You just have to be careful of what you're trying to do with them. Now, on page 99, when they're talking about what are some of the stories that are best, types of traditional literature that really do well for children, and really, it says the community tale uses repetition, like the gingerbread man with the runaway cookie, accumulation and rhythm. I suppose you could even do a first day of Christmas kind of thing as cumulative tale. The rhythm to make an entertaining story out of the barest of plots. Because of its simplicity, rhythm, and humor, this tale has a special appeal to young children. That's for older children, though. So this answer is wrong, and I'll have to think of what it would be for older children. Maybe I copied the question wrong. I'll clean it up, though. It's for younger children, okay? For younger children is the communicative tale. And I just have to change that. I obviously put the wrong word in there. Okay. I'm glad I went over this, because I found a couple errors. That happens. Oh, God, writing these quizzes takes a long time. I want you to do a good job on them. And so this quiz is up now, and it'll remain so until a week from Monday, when I'll see you, and we'll talk about some fun and interesting